The Duke caught her escaping through his window. "Wrong room," she whispered, but he refused to let her go. A true real-life story. It was already past midnight when the candle on the writing desk burned down to nothing. The room went dark all at once, in the way candles end. No warning, no flicker, just light, and then the absence of it. What was left was the thin stripe of moonlight that came in through the gap in the curtains and laid itself diagonally across the floor, like something that had fallen and not bothered to get up. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the grounds. One long note, unhurried, and then went quiet again. The whole house was asleep. Or at least, that was what Vivienne had spent the past 3 hours counting on. She had planned this carefully. She had planned most things carefully for the past year, because when you have no money and no real position and no one who can afford to lose anything on your behalf, you do not get to be careless. You learn the shape of rooms. You learn when doors creak and which ones do not. You learn that patience is not a personality trait. It is a tool, something you pick up and use when the situation requires it, the same as you would pick up a key or a lamp. She moved through the corridor on the second floor without making a sound. She knew where every loose board was. She had found them all in the first 2 weeks, walking these halls in the ordinary way, in daylight, as any companion would, testing them with her weight, noting which ones needed to be stepped over or stepped around. She had memorized the housekeeper's schedule too, and the gardener's early rounds, and which of the footmen was a light sleeper, and the fact that the third door on the left of the south corridor required you to lift it slightly on its hinges or the latch would not catch properly. These were not suspicious things to know. They were simply things that a careful person picked up, and Vivienne was a very careful person. She took the servants' stairs up to the 3rd floor. They were steeper than the main staircase and the wood was older, but they made no sound. She had used them enough times in daylight that they felt ordinary to her now, even in the dark. The east study was at the end of the hallway. She had a specific reason for going there, and the reason was a letter. She had seen it that afternoon. She had been delivering the afternoon correspondence to the household. It was one of her regular tasks, small enough that nobody paid attention to her while she did it, and there, on the corner of the writing desk in the east study, was an envelope. She had almost passed it without looking, but something had made her look, and when she had seen her name on it. Not the name she was using at this house. Her real name, Vivienne Calloway, written in an unfamiliar hand, the ink still carrying a slight sheen, as if it had arrived that morning. She had kept walking. She had not stopped. She had delivered the remaining correspondence and gone back to her duties, and sat through the rest of the afternoon with complete composure, because composure was not something she performed when she felt like it. It was something she maintained, the way you maintain a fire, steadily, even when it is inconvenient, especially when it is inconvenient. But she had thought about nothing else. The name she was using here was Mrs. Hartwell. The real Mrs. Hartwell was a widow living in comfortable retirement in Bath, a woman of steady temperament and no interest in returning to the working world. Vivienne had met her through a mutual acquaintance during the worst of the past year, and Mrs. Hartwell had listened to the whole story, the sister's debts, the father's illness, the shrinking of all available options, and had said, with the directness of a woman who had seen a great deal and found most of it manageable, "Take my letters. I am not using them. Pay me back when you are able, and in the meantime write to me twice a month. I find large houses interesting, and I am stuck in the countryside." It was not the most conventional arrangement, but then, nothing about the past year had been conventional. So Vivienne Calloway had become Mrs. Hartwell, and Mrs. Hartwell had got a position at Ravenscroft Manor as companion to Lady Catherine, and Lady Catherine had turned out to be genuinely kind and sharply intelligent and the sort of person you could not help caring about, which had made everything more complicated and also, in its way, better than it might have been. But now someone knew where she was. She needed that letter. She needed to read it and understand how serious this was, and decide what to do before anyone else in the house saw it, before anyone thought to compare the name on the envelope to the name of the woman who had been quietly and uneventfully employed here for 6.5 weeks. She reached the 3rd floor landing. turned left. The east study door was slightly open. That was not right. She had been the last person in that room that afternoon, and she had not left the door open. She was certain of this the way she was certain of all the small logistical details she kept in her head, firmly, specifically, without room for doubt. She stopped, put her back against the wall, listened with the particular quality of listening that is less about sound and more about feeling, the kind of attention you give to a room you are not sure about. Nothing. The house breathed around her the way old houses breathe at night. Small sounds, wood against wood, a pipe settling somewhere, the wind finding the gaps in old window frames. She counted 60 seconds. Then she moved to the door and pushed it open with her fingertips, slowly, staying to the side of the frame. The study was dark. The fireplace had burned down to embers, barely enough to see by, just a faint orange glow that lit nothing except itself. The curtains on the far window were not drawn, and the moonlight from outside came in and made a pale rectangle on the floor. The writing desk was to her left. She crossed to it, found the envelope on the corner where she had seen it that afternoon, picked it up, and then a voice came out of the dark corner of the room and said, "I would not go near that window if I were you." She spun around so fast that her elbow caught the corner of the desk. Pain shot from her elbow to her shoulder, and she bit down on it, breathed through it, did not make a sound. She had learned early in childhood, long before any of this, that making noise when you are startled only causes more problems, and so she had taught herself not to do it. There was a man in the armchair in the corner. She had not seen him because the chair was set back from the firelight, tucked into the shadow beside the bookcase, and because he had been absolutely still, not tense, just still, the way someone is still when they have been in the same position for long enough that stillness has become the default. He had a glass in his right hand, something dark, brandy probably, and he was watching her with an expression that was entirely free of alarm or anger. There was something almost analytical about it, like a person who has found an unexpected variable in a problem they thought was straightforward. She looked at the window he had mentioned, then at him, then at the window again. "The ledge on the outside is rotten along the left side," he said, with the same quiet, even tone, the voice of a man who had decided at some point that volume was a form of inefficiency. The repair was scheduled for August. The man did not come. If you step out there in the dark, you will put your weight on that left side, and you will fall. The drop to the rose garden is approximately 38 feet. He took a slow sip of his brandy. "I have looked at those roses. They have thorns like fishing hooks. I do not recommend the experience." Vivienne's mind was running through the situation at considerable speed. She was doing her best to keep this invisible, which was something she had a great deal of practice at. She made herself look at him properly. He was perhaps 35, or a few years more. It was difficult to say. Dark hair, not particularly tidy, as if he had been in that chair for several hours, and had somewhere around 10 o'clock given up caring about appearances. His jacket was folded over the arm of the chair. He was in shirt sleeves, the cuffs undone and rolled slightly back, not disheveled exactly, more like a man who had reached the end of formality for the day and found a comfortable stopping point. She could see immediately that he was not a servant. The posture alone told you that. He sat in the armchair the way a person sits in furniture they have always owned, not considering his right to be there, not adjusting to it, just inhabiting it. That kind of ease with a chair was not something that happened to people who worked in houses. It happened to people who lived in them. Which meant that the situation was very much worse than she had thought 30 seconds ago. "Wrong room," she said. She pitched her voice at something between apologetic and mildly embarrassed, the natural register of a woman who has made a harmless mistake in the middle of the night in someone's house. "I am so sorry. I was looking for the library. I must have got entirely turned around in the dark. I will just—" She made a small gesture toward the door. "The library is on the ground floor," he said. "West wing." "Yes, of course. I did get turned around badly. I will." He looked at the envelope in her hand. She looked at the envelope in her hand. He took another slow sip from his glass and said absolutely nothing, and somehow that was worse than if he had spoken. She set the envelope back down on the desk. She folded her hands together in front of her. She was very good at looking calm, even when everything inside her was working through possibilities very quickly, and she used that skill now. "Come away from the window and sit down," he said. "We are going to speak to each other. I don't believe there is anything." "Sit down," he said, for the second time, and there was something in the repetition, quiet as it was, that had the quality of a door closing. Not a threat, not anger, just a finality that made arguing feel like pushing against something that was not going to move. He added, after a moment, "Please," as if he had remembered it was polite. She sat in the straight-back chair near the desk. He remained in his armchair. The fire between them had mostly given up. His name was Edmund Hargrove. She had known this in the abstract, the way you know the name of a person who is responsible for the house you work in without necessarily expecting to encounter them. He was the Duke of Ashford. The estate was his. The land, the house, the money, all of it. His aunt, Lady Catherine, was the woman Vivienne served, and Lady Catherine was here at his arrangement and his expense. The servants spoke about him in the way servants speak about a kind of weather, something that would happen eventually and that you prepared for but did not spend much time dwelling on. He had been in the army, they said. He had come back from that changed in a way nobody could precisely describe. He spent most of his time in London. He came to the manor rarely. He was not by any account a man who made things warm and easy, but he was also not a man who was deliberately unkind, and in Vivienne's experience those were not the same thing at all. Deliberate unkindness required a kind of energy that most genuinely cold people never bothered with. She had not expected to meet him. She had done her best, in fact, to calculate when he was unlikely to be at the manor, which was part of why she had allowed herself to believe that 6 weeks was long enough to stay. She was now sitting across from him in the dark and revising several assumptions. "You arrived here 6 weeks ago," he said, not a question. "Yes. As a companion to my aunt, under the name Mrs. Hartwell." She said nothing. "The envelope on the desk is addressed to someone called Vivienne Calloway." Still nothing. She met his gaze and kept it there, which was harder than it sounded. He stood up. Not quickly. He set his brandy glass down on the table beside the chair, with the deliberate care of a man who does everything with deliberate care, and stood, and walked to the window. He put his hands behind his back, and looked out at the grounds in the dark. She watched him. There was something about his posture, the hands clasped, the stillness, that was almost formal, as if he were standing on a parade ground rather than in his own study at midnight. "My aunt likes you," he said, to the window. She had not expected that to be the next sentence. She waited for what came after it. "She wrote to me 3 weeks after your arrival. She said your reading voice was good, that you did not rush the sentences or flatten the meaning out of them. She said you had what she called patience with language, which is a thing she values enormously and finds rare." He paused. "She also said you did not talk over her when she was thinking. She said you sat with the silence instead of filling it with something less useful." Vivienne said nothing. Lady Catherine, she was beginning to understand, was sharper than she had given her credit for, and had apparently been paying close attention from the beginning. "She said," he continued, and there was something now in his tone that she could not quite name, not amusement exactly, but adjacent to it, that you reminded her of someone she used to know who was also very skilled at not answering questions she did not want to answer. "Your aunt is a perceptive woman." "She is." He turned from the window. "Who are you? Actually." He said it without inflection, not an accusation, not particularly gentle, just a direct request for information that he had apparently been patient enough to wait to ask until he had given her enough rope to see what she would do with it. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought through what was available to her. She could lie again. She was capable of it. She had proven that with some consistency over the past year. She could elaborate on the Mrs. Hartwell story, add detail, hold the line. She was good enough at it that she might even succeed. But she looked at his face, and his face was the face of a person who had already made up his mind about the shape of this conversation, and who was simply waiting for her to arrive at the same place. There was no point in performing for an audience that has already seen behind the curtain. "My name is Vivienne Calloway," she said. "I am not a widow. I have never been employed professionally as a companion. I am 24 years old. I have a younger sister who accumulated debts she could not repay, and a father whose health has left him unable to work, and I needed this position badly enough that I borrowed someone else's professional history to get it." He listened. He did not interrupt, or shift, or react in any visible way. He just listened, with the full attention of someone for whom listening was a professional skill. "The woman whose name I borrowed gave it to me willingly," she continued. "She is not harmed by this arrangement. But your aunt was not told the truth, and I am sorry for that. Genuinely, she has been kind to me in ways she did not have to be, and she deserved better from me than I gave her." He was quiet for a moment, after she stopped speaking. The fire gave a small sound, a settling of ash. "How much does your sister owe?" he said. She blinked. Of all the questions she had been preparing for, this was not among them. "That is not." "How much?" She told him. The number felt the way it always felt when she said it aloud, not like a number at all, but like a weight. He received it the way you receive a piece of information that confirms something you had already suspected, with a small nod, minimal expression, and the letter. "Tell me about the letter. I believe a solicitor has been hired to locate me. I do not know by whom. The letter arrived today. I needed to read it before I could understand what I was facing." "Read it now," he said. "In the light from the window. Go on." She picked up the envelope, broke the seal, moved to where the moonlight was strongest, and read it. Her face did not change. She had trained herself, over a long year, not to let her face change when things went badly. But her hands went perfectly still, which was its own kind of signal. "A solicitor," she said. "He has identified me, connected this name to that one. He intends to write to the house directly, to ask about me, if I do not respond to him within 7 days." She set the letter back on the desk. "So the situation," he said, "that was manageable this morning, has become considerably more urgent." "Yes." He was quiet again. She watched him think. It was the same quality of stillness she had noticed before. Not empty, not passive, a stillness that had things moving inside it. "I have a proposal," he said. "I assumed you might." Something shifted very slightly in his expression. "I want to be clear before I explain it, that this is a practical matter entirely. I am not unaware of how the situation looks from your position, and I understand that your instinct right now is to be cautious of whatever I say next. That is a reasonable instinct, but this is not a complicated offer, and I have no hidden purpose in making it." "Go on," she said. He told her about the dinner. It was in 3 weeks. End of season, family and county, 40 or 50 people including his mother. His mother had been, for the better part of 8 months, conducting what he described as a coordinated campaign on behalf of a certain countess from the south, a woman who was eligible, who was suitable, and who was perfectly pleasant, as far as he could determine, but whom he had absolutely no intention of marrying.
The issue was not the countess.
The issue was the architecture around her, the sense that his personal life had been folded into a project that other people were managing. He was 36 years old. He had survived 4 years of war, run a large estate through difficult years, made decisions in circumstances that were significantly harder than this one. He was not a man who needed his future arranged for him. But arguing with his mother, and here he said this with a weary precision that she found, involuntarily, slightly funny, was a spectacularly inefficient use of time. She had limitless patience for argument and an absolute refusal to concede any ground under any circumstances, and he had found over 36 years that the most effective response was not to engage at the point of attack, but to remove the thing she was attacking from the table entirely. What he needed, in 3 weeks, was a companion at the dinner who made the question of the countess simply irrelevant. Someone settled, someone his mother could not easily reconstruct an argument around. In exchange, he would deal with the solicitor. He would settle her sister's debts. He named a sum that was precise to the number, which told her he had already made some inquiries. She could remain at Ravenscroft for the full 3 weeks and leave properly, not in the middle of the night, not running, not in a way that left questions. No one in the household would be told anything had changed. "That is the arrangement," he said, "if you want it." She thought about it. She gave herself the time to think about it properly, because she did not make decisions quickly when she could avoid it. She looked at the letter on the desk. She thought about the solicitor and the 7-day window. She thought about Thursday and Lady Catherine's appointment and the way the old woman's hands shook very slightly when she was frightened and tried to hide it. "You are offering a great deal," she said finally. "From where I am sitting, this arrangement is almost entirely to my benefit. What do you actually get?" "I get a resolution to something my mother has been building for 8 months without having to argue about it directly," he said, "and my aunt retains her companion for the remainder of the time she can be here, which matters to me considerably." "And if I simply left tonight," she said, "you would have grounds to expose me. You could have done it already." "Yes, but you are not doing that." "No." "Why?" He looked at the fire. "I have been in situations where all the options were bad," he said. "I found it unpleasant. I do not enjoy being the reason someone else finds themselves there." He said it simply, without particular weight, as if it were just a fact about himself, like saying he did not care for a certain kind of music. "Also," he added, after a moment, "my aunt. She has not had much that has been good this year. I would like her to have the last weeks of her time here be comfortable. You make them comfortable. That is worth something to me." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "I accept." He nodded once. "Very practical. Very final. Good. Go back to bed. In the morning, we will speak briefly, and after that, this conversation will not be referred to again between us. The arrangement should look like nothing at all." She stood, moved toward the door, and then, because she was tired of swallowing things, "Your Grace." "Yes." "What I did, coming here under a false name, letting your aunt believe something that was not true, I am sorry for it. Not as part of the arrangement, just separately." He looked at her for a moment. His expression was the contained one she was becoming, she realized, slightly familiar with. Not cold, just held in, the way you hold something carefully when you are not sure how it will land. "I know," he said. "Good night, Miss Calloway." She had expected the 3 weeks that followed to feel like sitting in a waiting room. They did not feel like that at all. The Thursday appointment happened on schedule. Vivienne spent the Wednesday evening with Lady Catherine in the usual way, which meant reading for an hour and then putting the book down and talking, not about anything that required attention, just conversation for its own sake, the kind that exists not to convey information, but to make a room feel less empty. Lady Catherine sometimes reached for her hand while they talked. She did it the way old people sometimes do, not dramatically, not with any particular intention, just the natural reaching of a person who had lived long enough to know that the presence of another body nearby was its own form of comfort. Vivienne had not been prepared for that when she first arrived. She had not been prepared for how much Lady Catherine would come to matter. The doctor came Thursday. He said what everyone had known he would say. Lady Catherine was brisk in front of him, politely attentive, asking the right questions, receiving the answers with the composure of a woman who had been receiving difficult news for long enough that she had developed a way to do it with dignity. She thanked the doctor. She showed him to the door. Then she came back into the sitting room and sat down in her chair, and was very quiet and very small for a while. Vivienne stayed an extra hour. She did not ask permission, and Lady Catherine did not comment on it. They sat together, and after a while they played cards because Lady Catherine had said once that she found cards useful in moments like these. They gave your hands something to do and your mind something to count, and that combination, she found, was good for grief. Edmund was in the house now, and the house felt different for it, not unpleasantly, but noticeably. He kept mainly to the study or the library. He rode out early in the mornings, before most of the household was moving, and came back looking like a man who had solved something through motion rather than thought. He appeared at breakfast every morning. He sat at one end of the table, and Vivienne sat at the other, and they spoke to each other with the polite brevity of professional acquaintances, which was exactly right for what the situation needed, and also, she found, required more effort than she wanted to admit. On the 5th day, she went to the library to return a book she had borrowed, and found him there. He was standing at one of the shelves with a volume open in his hands, reading with the focused attention of someone who had entirely forgotten they were in a room. He was so absorbed that he did not hear her come in, which surprised her slightly. He struck her as the sort of man who always heard things coming. She set her book on the return table, made a small sound stepping back, and was heading for the door when he said, without looking up, "What is your opinion of Dickens?" She stopped. "Which one?" "Bleak House, specifically." She considered. "I think he is one of the most gifted writers of the century," she said, "and I also find him infuriating in a very specific way." Now he looked up. "In what way?" "He writes as if the world is broken in all the ways it actually is broken," she said, "and as if he finds this fact both genuinely terrible and genuinely interesting. There is something underneath the sadness in his books, a kind of energy, almost a relish, and it is entirely real, and it is completely at odds with the surface of what he is saying. He is a man who is very sad about the world, and also a man who finds the world very compelling, and I think that is honest, but there is something about being confronted with that honesty that is slightly irritating, like being right and being told so when you wanted to be the one to say it first." He looked at her for a moment. "That," he said, "is exactly the thing I have not been able to name about his writing for 20 years. Is it? I knew there was something wrong with reading him, and I could never say what. You have just said it." He said it simply, as a fact, the way he said most things. She almost smiled. She caught it just before it arrived and turned it into something more neutral, but not quickly enough, and he saw it. She could tell by the very small change around his eyes, not a smile from him either, but the area around one. "You correct your letters," she said, before she had properly decided to say it. "I beg your pardon?" "I have been in the dining room while you dictate the morning correspondence. When the writing is done, you take it back and you read it again, and then you change something. Every single time, without exception. I have never seen you send a letter on the first version." A pause. "I was not aware that was observable. I observe things. It is a habit. Why do you do it?" He was quiet for a moment. She had the impression, watching him, that he was deciding whether this was a question he wanted to answer honestly or redirect. He looked at the book in his hands. "It is a habit from the army," he said. "When you are writing orders, real operational orders, the kind that determine what happens to people, you learn very quickly that the precision of language is not a stylistic preference. It is the difference between something working and something failing, and in the army those two outcomes are not equally bad. I came back from that with a deep suspicion of first drafts." He paused. "Of most first things, honestly. The first version of anything is usually approximately right. It takes another pass to actually be right." "That seems," she said carefully, "like a sensible way to live, rather than a compulsion to be embarrassed about. Most people find it tedious to be around. Most people," she said, "have never had the wrong word cost them very much." He looked at her then, a direct look, present in a way that his looks were not always present. Something had shifted slightly in the quality of it. "No," he said, after a moment, "I suppose they have not." She said good afternoon, and left with her returned book and her unreturned one, and she walked back to Lady Catherine's rooms, thinking about the conversation with the particular quality of attention you give to something you are trying to convince yourself is less significant than it feels. She did not entirely convince herself. The days continued. One evening the pump in the east wing failed, and water got into the corridor, and what followed was 2 hours of organized chaos, involving half the household, several towels, a carpenter who had to be woken, and the housekeeper saying the same 3 sentences to different people in an increasingly strained tone. Edmund dealt with all of it in about 40 minutes. He made 4 decisions: which carpenter, which rooms to close off, how to route the household around the problem, what to tell the guests who were staying, and he made them in rapid sequence without visible anxiety and without second-guessing any of them once they were made. Then he went back to whatever he had been doing. Vivienne, who had been watching from the end of the corridor while managing Lady Catherine's dinner tray, thought, "That is what he looks like when there is something actually wrong. No performance. Just the problem, and then the next step." One morning she found him standing alone in the garden, very still, looking at something in the rose beds. She was on her way to the kitchen, and she saw him through the side window. She did not go out or interrupt him. But later, coming back the same way, she looked at the spot where he had been standing and saw what he had been looking at, a particular climbing rose, at the base of the wall, trained up old wire, bare now for the season. She had heard from the housekeeper that Lady Catherine had planted it herself, years ago, before she became ill. He had stood there for a long time, looking at a bare rose in October. She thought about that for the rest of the day. One afternoon, Lady Catherine fell asleep in the middle of a sentence, the way she had started doing, quickly and without warning, her body simply deciding that it needed the rest, and taking it. Vivienne had been sitting across from her, and when the old woman's eyes closed and her breathing evened, Vivienne stayed where she was rather than leaving. She picked up her own book and read quietly. The room was warm. It was a comfortable afternoon. After about 20 minutes she became aware that Edmund was in the doorway. He was not doing anything. He was simply standing there, looking at his aunt's sleeping face, then at Vivienne, sitting across from her, a book open in her lap, staying without being asked. He did not say anything. He gave one of his small nods, the contained, economical kind that she had started to recognize as the nearest thing he had to a visible expression of something felt rather than just thought, and then withdrew without a word. She looked back at her book. She read the same sentence 4 times. 1 week before the dinner, she found out what he had done. The footman who usually handled the village post was unwell, so she went herself. It was a fine morning for it, cold and clear, the kind of autumn day where the light is bright without being warm, where everything looks slightly more itself than usual. She posted her letter and was waiting for the clerk to stamp it when she heard her real name. Not loudly. The clerk was a cheerful man who talked about everything at roughly the same volume, which was slightly too loud for most situations, and he was talking to the woman at the other end of the counter about the interesting week the post office had had. A solicitor's letter had come through, which was always notable. Someone from a big London firm, inquiring about a particular person. Very official tone, the clerk said. And then, and here Vivienne's attention sharpened to a point, someone from the manor had written back. Very quick, very final. Whoever it was, they had said there was nothing to pursue, and that further inquiries in the village would be noted and investigated. The clerk said it in an admiring tone, as if he found the whole thing pleasantly dramatic. Vivienne paid for her postage and walked back to the manor. She found Edmund in the library, which was where he spent most afternoons. He was reading, again, with the same complete absorption, and again he did not look up when she came in. She let the door close behind her. "You wrote back to the solicitor," she said. He turned a page. "Yes." "What did you say exactly?" "That inquiries about any person connected to Ravenscroft should be addressed to me directly, that I had looked into the matter myself and found nothing that required further attention, and that continued inquiries at the local level would be treated as interference in a private household and dealt with accordingly." He paused. "I also mentioned that I had several people in London with access to the kind of information that tends to make solicitors who work for unscrupulous clients find other employment." "That was not part of what we agreed." He set the book down and looked at her. "Your sister's debts were part of what we agreed. Those are also settled." The solicitor was not. "No," he said. "It was not." She waited. He looked at her with the same directness she had noticed growing in him over the past 2 weeks. Less of the measured distance, more of something that had decided to stop measuring. "Why?" she asked. "Because I found I did not want you to have to deal with it on top of everything else." He said it with the same tone he used for practical statements, as if it were simply a fact. You have enough to manage. She stood in the middle of the library with the dust and the shelves and the afternoon light coming in from the high windows, and she felt something shift in the arrangement she had made with herself. The one where she kept things in their proper categories and made sure that nothing crossed into a category it was not supposed to be in. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was glad of that. "Go and sit with my aunt. She asked where you were an hour ago." She went, but she stood in the hallway for a moment first, with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, breathing carefully. She was thinking about a particular arithmetic, the one she had been running for the past year, the one that said a person with no money and no position and no room for error could not afford to let herself want things she had not planned for. It was a sound arithmetic. It had kept her safe. But arithmetic did not account for the fact that someone had paid off her sister's debts without being asked to, and had written a letter to a threatening solicitor, and had looked at her in the doorway of a room where she was keeping a sick woman company, and nodded, as if that nodding was the only thing he had available to express what he was feeling. She realized, in some difficulty. 3 evenings before the dinner, she went to the portrait gallery to retrieve a book she had left there, and found Edmund standing in front of one of the large paintings. He was not moving, not doing anything, except standing and looking. She saw him as soon as she came through the door, and could have turned around immediately, and he would not have known. She did not turn around. She was not entirely sure why, except that there was something about the way he was standing that made backing away feel like the wrong kind of leaving. The painting was a large formal portrait, a man in dark clothing, painted in the style of 30 or 40 years ago, a serious face, good bones, and something in the expression that she recognized immediately because she had seen it on the face of the man standing in front of it, in those moments when he did not know he was being observed. "Your father?" she said softly. "Yes." She walked further into the gallery. He did not tell her to stop. She stood beside him and looked at the painting. The man in it was not old, perhaps 50, in his prime. He had the look of someone who held himself with authority so habitual it had become physical. You could see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight forward tilt of his chin, and behind all of that, there in his eyes, a permanent mild dissatisfaction, not rage, not even unhappiness exactly, just the settled conviction that the world was consistently, predictably, falling slightly short. "He looks," she said, "like a man who found most things disappointing." Something flickered through Edmund's face, quick and involuntary. "That," he said, "is an accurate assessment of a man you never met. Portraits are honest, especially old ones. People did not know how to manage what their faces did, sitting still for that long. Whatever they actually felt came out." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He was disappointed in most things. In me, specifically, I think the most precise description is that I was not the right shape. He wanted someone who would take what was given to them without question and add to it without friction. I was not capable of that. I asked too many questions and I had too many opinions about which things were worth doing and which were not." He said it without bitterness, which was in some ways more striking than bitterness would have been, just an accounting of fact. "That sounds like a quality," she said, "that happened to be inconvenient for someone." He looked at her sideways, then at the painting again. "Why are you here at this hour?" he asked. She held up the book she had come to retrieve. He nodded once. Neither of them moved toward the door. The gallery was long and quietly lit, the paintings on both sides presiding over their patch of wall, with the authority of people who had nothing left to lose from being looked at. Outside, the wind had come up again, the steady October wind that came off the sea, and the house made the small adjustments it always made, settling, flexing slightly, doing what it had been built to do. "My aunt told me something today," Edmund said. He was looking at the portrait again, not at her. "She said that you are the only person who treats her as if she is still a person, rather than a situation that needs to be managed carefully." Vivienne said nothing. "She said you look at her, when you speak to her, when you listen to her." That your attention does not drift toward the window or the door or somewhere else while you are deciding what to say next. She is worth looking at, Vivienne said simply. She has things to say. She has always had things to say. That does not stop being true because she is ill. He turned and looked at her fully, and she made the choice. It was a choice, she would know that later, to look back, not to find something to do with her hands, or glance at the painting, or make some small adjustment that would give her somewhere to put her eyes. She looked at him. The silence that came after had weight. "The dinner is in 3 days," he said. "I know." After it, "I know," she said again, quietly. "I will make arrangements on Monday." He held her gaze one moment longer. Then he looked back at the portrait. "Good night, Miss Calloway." "Good night." She walked back to her room with her book in her hand, and she did not cry, because she had not allowed herself to cry in a long time, and she was not going to begin now, not over this. She was practical. She had been practical through things considerably harder than this. But her candle took 3 tries to light, and she lay in her bed for a long time in the dark, listening to the wind outside, before she slept. The gown was burgundy, and she had not planned that. Lady Catherine had mentioned the wardrobe the week before, an old one, full of dresses from 20 or 30 years ago, most of them in better condition than they had any right to be. She had pointed Vivienne toward it and said, with the matter-of-fact generosity that was typical of her, "Take whatever fits. There is no reason for them to sit there." Vivienne had gone through them looking for something plain and appropriate, a dark color, something that would read as correct without drawing attention. She found 3 that would work. She was about to close the wardrobe when she saw the burgundy one, pushed to the very back. She pulled it out and held it at arm's length. Deep red, almost wine dark, simple lines, good fabric, the kind that had weight and movement and held its shape. She put it back, then she took it out again. She wore it. She came down the main staircase at 7 in the evening. Edmund was in the entrance hall with his back mostly to the stairs, speaking with a guest who had arrived early, a stout man with opinions, whom she had briefly encountered that afternoon and recognized immediately as someone who would talk about land management for the entire first course, if not redirected. Edmund was half listening and half looking at something over the man's shoulder, which was the expression of a man who had learned to appear attentive during conversations that did not require actual attention. He did not see her until she was nearly at the bottom step. She saw him register the movement, the automatic glance that people make at motion, and then she saw him stop. He looked at her for 2 full seconds. Then he looked away and continued his sentence without any gap that an outsider would have noticed. She joined them. He introduced her correctly and completely, and then the stout man moved on to find someone to talk to about hedgerows. Edmund offered his arm. "You look well," he said, low and level and entirely for her. "Your mother is by the fireplace," she said, at the same register. "She has been angling the Countess in your direction with her body language for about 20 minutes. Do not look yet. It will only encourage her." He did not look yet. "Is the Countess cooperative?" "The Countess appears to have already read the situation accurately and decided on grace. She is talking to your cousin. It is going very well for both of them." "My cousin is charming," he said. "He has no money, but he is charming." "He is also very handsome," she said. She seems to have noticed. He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him. She felt it through his arm, where her hand was resting, and she thought, that small sound. That is the thing that is going to cost me something. The dinner was long and well attended, and full of the kind of social undercurrents that required constant navigation. Vivienne navigated them the way she navigated most things, from the inside, without making it visible. She talked to people when they wanted talking to, listened when they wanted listening to, and kept one part of her attention on Edmund throughout the evening, which she told herself was because that was part of the arrangement, and which she knew, if she was honest, was not entirely why. He introduced her naturally and without awkwardness to everyone who mattered. When an older peer interrupted her mid-sentence, automatically, without meaning anything by it, simply because he was the sort of man who had always done that without anyone stopping him, Edmund paused the conversation and said, pleasantly and without a single unnecessary word, Miss Calloway was speaking. I would like to hear what she was going to say. The man looked startled. He moved on. He did not interrupt again. She did the same for him, in a different way. There was a moment in the middle of the main course when someone said, a name, or a date, or something in between, went through him like a cold wind, briefly and completely. She saw it happen. No one else was watching closely enough to catch it. She pulled the conversation sideways with a question aimed at the guest on the other side of the table. A bright, interested question, the kind that requires a proper answer. And the moment passed, and when she glanced at Edmund, he was looking at his plate with an expression that was as close as she had seen him come to relief. By the end of the fish course, Edmund's mother had stopped pointing her expressions at the Countess. By the end of the main course, the Countess and Edmund's cousin had progressed to talking with their heads slightly together over a shared joke, which was a very good sign. By the time the guests migrated to the drawing rooms and gardens, the evening had been decided. Vivienne slipped out to the terrace when she had a gap. She needed the air. The night was properly cold, October cold, the kind that is clean and absolute, and the sky was full of stars in the way that only happens far from the city. She could hear the sea below the cliff, steady and indifferent, doing what it had been doing for centuries, and would do for centuries more. Edmund came out after a few minutes. She heard the door and did not turn around. He came and stood beside her at the railing. They looked at the dark grounds for a moment. The evening went well, he said. It did. My mother has stopped sending signals. I take this as an unconditional victory. She has redirected her attention to your cousin's situation with the Countess. She seems to approve. My cousin is charming and has no money. The Countess has money and no husband. My mother loves a project. He said it dryly, but not unkindly. Everyone will be fine. Yes, she said. I think so. A comfortable silence. The stars did not move. The sea kept its rhythm. You covered for me tonight, he said, during the main course. I did not do it for any particular reason. I know. That is why I mentioned it. She turned and looked at him. He was already looking at her. Miss Calloway. Yes. The arrangement ends next week. Something quieted in her. I know. I want to tell you something before it does. He said it carefully, with the particular care of a man who has thought about this sentence before saying it. I find that I do not want you to leave. I have been trying to decide what to do with that for the better part of 10 days, and I have come to the conclusion that the most efficient thing is simply to say it. She did not say anything. I am aware that I am difficult, he said. I hold myself at a distance from things. I am not warm in any obvious way. I take longer than most people to say what I mean, and I correct my letters twice, and I am better with problems than with feelings. I know all of this about myself. He paused. But I looked for you at breakfast every morning this week before I came downstairs. That is not something I had been in the habit of doing before. She looked at him, this careful, contained, deeply careful man, and she thought about all the reasons this was complicated, and she thought about the arithmetic, and she thought about the past year, and she thought about her sister and her father, and the borrowed name and the letter, and the rotten ledge, and the 38 feet into the rose garden. And then she thought about the nod in the doorway, and Dickens, and the letters corrected twice, and the rose in October. Edmund, she said, his name, for the first time. Neither of them pointed at it, but it was there. Yes. I have to tell you certain things clearly. I am not a widow. I have no money to speak of. My family situation is genuinely complicated and unlikely to become straightforward. I have spent the past year telling people things that were not true, and the reason I stopped doing it with you is that I could not make myself do it. That is all of it. You should know all of it. I do know all of it, he said. I have known it for 3 weeks. It has not changed what I think. Then what do you think? I think about the woman who sat with my aunt the night before a frightening appointment, and talked to her until she was calm enough to sleep, he said. I think about the woman who said something true about Dickens that I could not say myself. I think about someone who covered for me tonight at dinner without making me aware that she was doing it, who stayed in that room when my aunt fell asleep because it was the right thing to do, who stood in this house under a false name because the people she loved needed her to. He looked at her steadily. None of that has anything to do with money or position. It has to do with who you actually are. The stars were out. The sea was somewhere below. I would like, he said, very carefully, to propose a different arrangement, if you are willing to hear it. I am listening. A permanent one, with completely different terms, no end date. She looked at him for a long moment. That is a rather significant proposal for a man standing on a terrace in October. Yes, it is. You are certain? I correct my letters twice before I send them, he said. I have thought about this for 10 days. I do not make proposals without thinking them through. She looked at him. The wind was cold. The stars were very bright. And Vivienne Calloway, who had spent an entire year being careful, who had planned everything and managed everything and kept every necessary distance and done the arithmetic over and over to prove to herself that she could not afford to want things she had not planned for, decided, very deliberately, to stop being careful. Yes, she said. All right, yes. He let out a small breath. Just that. Almost nothing. She heard it. What came after was not simple. She had expected that, and she was right. Her real name had to be introduced properly, not explained away or softened, but brought into the open. Edmund told Lady Catherine first. He went to her sitting room the morning after the dinner and sat down and told her everything, clearly and without decoration. Vivienne was not there for this conversation, but she heard afterward how it had gone. Edmund had described it as efficient, which meant that Lady Catherine had listened without interrupting and had then sat with it for a moment, and then said, "Well, I am glad she is staying." That afternoon, Lady Catherine held Vivienne's hand and said, "I knew something was not quite right. I did not push, because you were doing your job well, and I did not want to lose you over a name." Then she patted her hand twice, in the crisp way she had, and said, "Now, where are we in the book?" The household was told in the way Edmund handled most things, methodically, in order of who needed to know first. The housekeeper received the information with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for the unusual thing to reveal itself and was simply glad to have it confirmed. She asked 2 practical questions, received 2 practical answers, and went back to managing the household, which she did not require anyone's assistance to do. Edmund's mother was harder, as expected. She came for Sunday lunch 3 weeks later, which was the first time she and Vivienne had been in the same room since the dinner. She looked at Vivienne with the full force of her assessment, which was considerable, and she looked at her son, and something in what she saw made her put down whatever argument she had brought with her. She did not say anything warm, but she stopped saying things cold, and in a woman like her, that was its own form of relenting. The solicitor did not write again. Rosalind, Vivienne's sister, the real one, wrote when she received the news about the debts. The letter arrived in pieces, first relief, then shame, then love, all 3 tangled together in the way that only happens in letters between people who have known each other their whole lives. Vivienne read it 3 times. She kept it. Lady Catherine had 2 more months at Ravenscroft, and they were good months. Vivienne was there every morning. Edmund was there on most days, and without any of them planning it or talking about it, the 3 of them fell into a rhythm. Cards in the evenings, reading in the afternoons, slow walks in the garden on the days when it was dry enough, and Lady Catherine felt strong enough. The garden was finished for the year, everything drawn in and brown at the edges, but Lady Catherine knew the name of every plant in it, and told their stories while they walked. When Lady Catherine left, to a proper facility, not far, close enough to visit regularly, she said her goodbyes with the same composure she brought to most things. She embraced Edmund with the brevity of people who do not perform affection but feel it deeply, and then she took Vivienne's face in both her hands, the cool, dry hands of an old woman who had been everywhere and outlasted almost everyone she had known, and she looked at her for a long moment and said, "You looked at me." Just that. Vivienne could not speak. She nodded. Lady Catherine nodded back. Then she got into the carriage. Edmund and Vivienne were married in the spring. It was not a large wedding. They had both decided this separately and had been relieved to find, when it came up, that they agreed. Family, a small number of friends, the staff of the house who wanted to be there, which was most of them. The ceremony was short and said what needed to be said. The lunch afterward went on for a long time. In the good way. The way that only happens when the people in the room actually want to be there and nobody is watching the clock. Vivienne wore blue. Edmund wore the expression of a man who had stopped managing himself for one morning and found it, on balance, survivable. When she came toward him across the room, he looked at her the way she had looked at Lady Catherine, not past her, not at the ceiling or the wall while deciding what to say, but at her, fully, with everything his face was capable of when he stopped holding it back. She saw it. She let herself see it. That was still a choice, would always be a choice, but she was getting better at making it without flinching. She had spent a long time not letting herself see things that were going to cost her something to feel. It had been practical. It had been necessary, genuinely necessary, and she was not going to tell herself it had been weakness. But it had also been its own kind of poverty, the kind that is not about money, that has no name that most people reach for easily, but that is real and that leaves its mark. She was done with it now. 1 year after the night in the East Study, she opened the window. The same window, the one with the view of the rose garden 38 feet below. Someone had repaired the ledge in the spring. She had watched a carpenter replace the bad boards with good ones, testing his weight on them slowly, twice, before he declared the job done. The window had worked properly since then. She had just never opened it. She opened it on a Tuesday morning in October. The air came in immediately, cold and damp, and carrying the smell of turned earth and the distant edge of the sea. The grounds below were golden and brown. The roses were finished for the year, stripped back to bare thorny branches, the same as they had been that night a year ago. She looked at the drop, 38 feet, approximately, into the rose garden, into the thorns. She heard him come in behind her. He moved quietly. She had long stopped being startled by it. She knew his footfall the way you know the sounds of a house, not by thinking about it, but just because you have been there long enough that it becomes part of the background of your ordinary life. "Still thinking about escaping?" he said. She stayed at the window for one more moment, looking at the grounds and the cliff and the gray, bright sea, looking at the world she had almost run away from in the middle of the night. Then she closed the window, turned around. He was in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, one cup of tea in his hand and the Morning Post in the other. A letter he was already, she could tell from the particular quality of his focus, composing a reply to in his head. He would write it out, he would read it back, he would change something, he would send it. She found she would not change any of it. Not any more, she said. He looked at her, 2 seconds longer than strictly necessary, full of something he had stopped trying to keep off his face a long time ago. "Good," he said. "Come and have breakfast." She did. "Come, end of story."